Thank you so much, Milton. We're getting some feedback in the chat. Also, I mean, if you're as stunned as I am by that incredible download of software and firmware into our brains, then maybe sometimes rather than thinking of a question, it might be just as appropriate to add something or simply ask for Milton to return to a point that went by, so quickly. If I could just ask one first question, Milton, and then we'll go to Neil and Tamara. You mentioned the fretboard abacus,
yes,
Milton, and I was thinking about how in Asian cultures and other cultures that teach arithmetic with the abacus, it becomes so much more than simply what one might imagine a calculator does, which is something you manipulate without actually learning any arithmetic, but simply, work mechanically. And we know that, in fact, it doesn't work that way, that people that do arithmetic with an abacus not only get a sense of the deep principles underlying arithmetic, but then build a kind of an imaginary abacus in their brains that they simply use anytime they need to do arithmetic, which they can then do incredibly quickly. And I mean, that very much corresponds to my experience of the fingerboard. And I'm wondering what you have found to be the pedagogical implications of the different ideas you've been presenting here today.
there are several implications, but the abacus comes from talking to you. Actually, that's why I use that term, because it's exactly right, and I think it's very neat that it looks like fret positions and strings. Basically, the simple constraint, is what makes it work. And one thing I'll say is that I was late to notation reading, much later than a lot of people here, I imagine. And I used to have to answer these questions, like what's a major sixth up from C, for example. And I would do it by imagining the fretboard in my head. If I didn't have a guitar then, I would literally hold my hand out to calculate with a guilt through college. And now I don't understand where that guilt came from, because it's the idea that we somehow have to know things. The body is somehow dirty and we can't touch our knowledge. We just have to have this abstracted thought, which is somehow higher. And I don't think that's necessarily true. Now, a lot of things have become automated, but I think by doing it that way, you actually have practical theoretical insight as well, because you're calculating, but you're connecting with something that has agency in your musical life. So I advocate the abacus. In terms of pedagogical implications, I formerly trained standard jazz and I teach jazz, and this has generally been at the center of jazz for years, the ideas of building on concepts from the inset into on the instrument to make your music, rather than music that's come from a score that you have to find somehow on the instrument. And this is not a value judgment, but all the things I talk about are deeply embedded with pedagogy, and I can talk about specific ones if you like, but we learn theory on the fretboard, essentially. I teach a lot of classical guitarists, jazz guitar, and I don't think, even though I have the material, I don't think we use a written down material to understand everything. The fretboard is our calculator.
Absolutely. Let me I was going to invite Neil and Tamara to ask their question.
All right.
Great.
Thank you so much for this fabulous talk, Milton. It was
Thank you.
yes,
Nice to
wonderful, wonderful. Thank you. A bunch of images came by. One of them was on, I think, the modes. You're thinking about that, very famous diagrammatic of Napoleon's march to Russia and, back, and how, yes, fantastic.
This one here.
Yes, that's really great.
Oh, thanks so much. This is an an idea of how the modes fit together, which I call the modal compass. And a designer saw it, my post of it, and made this version. So Lofvander did. And I'd love to talk about it because it's absolutely awesome. I adore the diatonic modes. But in this one diagram, it shows several relationships of the modes, which are extraordinary. And we teach the modes as in the sequential sense of the order that they emerge from the diatonic scale, Ionian, Dorian, Phrygian, and so on. But that is only a glimpse of how beautifully they interconnect. That relationship is on this diagram here because there are these arrows that go from Ionian to Dorian to Phrygian to Lydian to Mixolydian to Aeolian to Locrian and back to Ionian. That's the heptagon in the middle. But here's a beautiful thing. Okay, so let's take, for example, I've got a guitar here. So if we take Dorian, for example, actually we'll start with Lydian. Lydian has an augmented fourth. That's its character. I don't know if maybe you can hear the guitar. And what happens if we just move one note of Lydian down a semitone? The augmented fourth goes to the perfect fourth. It becomes Ionian. Then we drop the seventh. We get Mixolydian. Drop the third. We get Dorian. Drop the sixth. Aeolian. Drop the second. Get Phrygian. Drop the fifth. We get
Locrian.
Here's the beautiful thing. You drop the root
Of C. Locrian.
and you get B Lydian, and it goes round and round and round. So that's a beautiful thing. And another beautiful thing is that these are arranged in orders of brightness. Lydian is the brightest mode, Locrian is the darkest. In terms of sharps, but also in terms of experience for most people. You'll notice the flats are here. These are mirrors of each other. So Lydian, if you turn it upside down, it turns in to Locrian. Ionian turns to Phrygian, Mixolydian turns to Aeolian, and Dorian is perfectly symmetrical. And so when you look at the piano, it's actually a mirror from D on either side. That's what the diagram shows. I hope I answered that.
Is this
quickly
your
enough.
own sort of, is there a historical kind of understanding of this?
So
Like,
Persichetti,
Okay.
20th century harmony is when I first saw the upside downness of it, blew my mind,
Okay.
and it's actually the reason I studied music. The shifting thing I discovered,
okay.
and this representation I think I discovered, I don't know, but the sort of locking together kind of all fell together. So on my site, I have a few of these, what I call musical illustrations, which are sort of insights about music that are sort of rather pretty as well, sort of like scientific illustrations. They're sort of musically true and somewhat pretty, I think.
Yeah, fantastic.
Thank you.
I've invited Ollie Chandler to ask his question live.
Hey Milton, thanks so
Hey,
much.
hey.
That was brain meltingly good. So I'll try and make
Sorry.
some sense after that. But I mean, one of the things I thought was so exciting about it was very often when one analyzes music, you're condemned to use a language that's inherently abstract. And, you know, when I've written about guitar music in particular, I've always tried to take it back to the fretboard. But there's such a rich vocabulary for describing pitch abstractly. And then as soon as you get to the fretboard, it's difficult to find that language sometimes. So I was just wondering what you thought the analytical implications might be for your
So
discipline.
I adore abstracted musical mechanics. I probably didn't, in answering Jonathan, I was advocating the use of the instrument as a space for analysis, but not against abstracted thought. And in fact, the most beautiful thing is when they meld together. So as you can probably get from that modal talk, this is it's highly abstracted, although it's practical. I think when they meet in the middle, it's what's beautiful. But technology here has been really interesting to me, because I don't know if you can see this, but you know, anything I play on the guitar, we can see it as abstract. Can you see that? I'm playing that, but also in space, I am showing this hexagram, and you can see that it's a all interval tetrachord. So they are interlinked, and that was my the first section on ways of knowing. I love them being interlinked and broken and reset and seen this way. So yes, I love abstraction, but I'm most excited when the abstract musical mechanic is reflected in experience, which is not always the case in some analyses. I mean, good analyses are both objective and yet experientially resonant. I don't know if that helps.
No, it does. Thanks so much. And yeah, looking forward to exploring this more going forward. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Just to let people know that I'm mostly looking at the Q&A panel for potential questions, but I'm trying to keep an eye on the very amusing chat. But Milton, before I bring a couple of more people in, can we just explore the interface between your guitar and the fretboard remapper? Is it possible for you to play a guitar physically in any tuning and with any fretting?
You ask. Oh yeah, I see. Yes. Can you hear a MIDI piano sort of thing?
Yeah,
okay, great.
And I hear a Hendrix chord.
Thanks. So let's change this to, what do we want? We'll go with the Equinox tuning here. What's really beautiful is having that experience of playing, that familiarity, and then something else coming out. Jonathan D'Souza's voluntary self-sabotage was really profoundly important here with this, because and this is even called the D'Souza phone, this section here. This is a digital self-sabotage. And what's really amazing, I don't know if anyone's seen dual interval spaces, because they're a way of considering music in terms of two important pitch classes. So for example, I could say that my strings are going up in major thirds and my frets in semitones, and it's a little like this Faben piece. And you can do these reflections. And you're playing in that character, on that tonal landscape. But I can have the strings, for example, going up in tones. Or, for example, actually go down, like in semitones, or whatever you like. And each string can be different. I can't tell you how wonderful that feels to break that expectation. And D'Souza says, I think this in terms of Rosenwinkel, about breaking that tight auditory connection. It becomes redundant when you know exactly what you're going to play. But now if I play my 2/5, it's just the most wonderful thing for it to come out that way. And let me reset this. But it's so nice. You can do Gambale's clustered tuning. Where everything comes really close. This is physically plausible, but what's really lovely is you can make, for example, different strings go up on different rates than others. You hear that super high one? That's nice. I get to enjoy my playing much more this way, because we're so self-critical, but now I can sort of hear the music directly. I could do this for ages, so I'm going to just do one more thing. Let me reset this. This is the most beautiful thing, is that you can basically create access points where like it's a mirror on either side. So I'm going to make an access point around C. So as if I go up, it comes down. And what I can do is delay the whole thing. So I'll play my guitar now, and then I'll get the reverse version. Remember I said about Dorian being upside down? I'm playing C Dorian. But here's when abstraction works, because I can also see if C Dorian reflects around C, it also reflects around F sharp. Which means so does A Lydian. And it's like having a conversation with yourself. And any reversible scale will do. Anyway, I'll stop for now because I could go for ages.
The questions are coming in.
Good.
Mark,
I'm bleeding.
well, actually, Simon Hopkins, did you want to go first? Because I know you asked your question earlier in chat.
Oh gosh, yes. I don't know if can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Welcome.
Splendid. Well, hello, Milton.
Nice to see you.
So I actually have a specific memory of last year when for everyone else, I'm studying with Milton at the moment for a master's, and you asked me if memory serves, what's the fourth mode of the harmonic minor scale, and I had to figure it out to actually go, oh yes, well it's and which is great. And I do find working with traditionally trained, coming from a jazz background, studying with traditionally trained classical musicians who are infinitely superior instrumentalists that don't really seem to understand really what they're doing under their hands. But I guess the flip side to that, and my question is, you know, what are the limitations to understanding harmony in particular in this sort of digital way, you know? And I do worry that trying to study composition without access to any reasonable keyboard skills is really limiting. So I'd just be really interested in your thoughts on that.
It's a good question, and actually the talk, I think, was a defense of the guitar as a central space. And it's not necessarily a superior space, but it's the sort of thing where we learn a closed position C major D minor chord, but you're not allowed to play it. You're immediately withheld from the goods. And that's where keyboardists have that advantage, where their abstracted knowledge and their physical knowledge are far better aligned in that form of teaching. But then the question is, why can't notes be doubled? Why is a closed voicing a superior voicing? You know, I don't think it is. And what I advocate is an abstract and knowledge combined with the fretboard. There's issues with standard tuning, where, you know, if we played in fourths, I think it would be a different world and we'd have a wholly different experience about it. But there's trade-offs essentially. But essentially, if you want to, I'd be happy to talk to you about it. But all these devices like 251s and passing diminished chords, they make more sense to me on the guitar fretboard than they do on the keyboard. It's my first space. I can play keyboard, but the fact that things look different in different keys is really a struggle for me on the keyboard or on the saxophone if I played that also. So there are distinct advantages, which are of chromatic parallelism and shape recognition. This is what I suggest, and that's what the guitar's advantages are. And it comes at the cost of this awkward relationship with the stave, and a lot of things when we're like transcribing a piece or arranging a piece, it feels like we're making something fit. It doesn't emerge from that instrument. We're trying to put it on that instrument. And music written from the guitar sometimes has that imprint of being dictated from the guitar somehow. So yeah, these are issues that are good issues to have. What else are we going to do with our lives?
Well, don't ask me. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Moving on to the topic of fracture, disruption, sabotage, and so on, Mark Simos has a question. And then I've also invited Jonathan D'Souza to invite as last year's keynote speaker, perhaps to also just expand into that area. Mark, hi.
Hi, can you all hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, Milton, what a wonderful talk. You're definitely preaching to the converted in my case, and I'm on sabbatical, and I think I just want to spend my sabbatical playing with the Fretboard remapper now till the end of the year. But I was very struck by your comments in particular about sort of fluency, myopia, and that benefit of sort of deliberately sabotaging those links between the spaces. And I'd like to kind of draw attention to the pedagogical value of doing that. And in a way also provide a little bit of a defense of the pedagogical benefits of standard tuning. Because I noticed you said, well, if we were in perfect fourths, it would be a different world.
It would be a different one. I didn't say a better one.
Yeah.
It'd be a different one.
Just one quick detail is you mentioned a source for that perfect fourths tuning, and I just wasn't familiar of who that was that you were citing.
A jazz guitarist called Ant Law, absolutely wonderful, who's basically, that's his way. And I played a little bit of his music under that. He's just a wonderful guitar player. But what he says is it makes things that sound really difficult very easy, and things that should be easy almost impossible to play. So he can't play a lot of the normal repertoire and licks and cliches, which is both a limit and a strength, I think.
Right. No, so I'll have to check that out. The interesting thing is that when you are teaching kind of very basic guitar, not necessarily to jazz guitarists, but just people that are learning chord shapes, it turns out that tuning discrepancy in standard tuning provides like a very experiential way for people to have that disruption of,
I agree.
Of chord shape to musical quality. And I think by taking the insights that you kind of expressed in this talk and actually folding them into the pedagogical experience themselves, standard tuning turns out to be, in a way, like an ideal laboratory for creating those experiences at a very, basically just negotiating those shape changes across string systems.
I agree completely. And there's something about the feel of that Hendrix chord shape when I first experienced it as a kid, and the sound that comes out, which is a sort of pairing that it's hard to describe if one hasn't had that experience, but it's a gestalt, a holistic experience that is hard to imagine otherwise. I think there's also something to be said about the navigational aspect of that barre drift, the fact that the two E strings on either end, I think that is really cements the guitar's chromatic parallelism. And that's the issue I have with electric guitar pedagogy for reading. It's the sort of open position to higher position track doesn't sort of work as idiomatically as it does on the classic guitar, where the technique of playing an open position is somehow easier than higher positions. Whilst a guitar, 11th fret, 12th fret, 13th fret, we don't mind, when you're E's together, because it's so instant and intuitive. There's no fear of the higher frets.
It may historically be why that tuning was arrived at, but the asymmetry, which a lot of pedagogy and methods talk about as an obstacle to people learning the guitar, I'm just saying can be actually advantageous if you want to create those experiences in the student. But like for a beginning student, it's almost as mysterious to see the shape that they learned as an A chord, not give them a major chord somewhere else as your fretboard remapper is for more advanced players.
I agree.
Yeah.
But there's something about those double stops too that I think that it creates sparks when something doesn't come out exactly as you imagine. When we have those double stops on sometimes E to A, sometimes C to E, there's something just wonderful about having something that feels intuitive and idiomatic that creates something different from the same shape. And I think that break is what brings people into the guitar. And I love standard tuning. And I should say that I spend all my acoustic life practically in standard tuning. What I do sometimes is I play this and I find out where they are in standard tuning. So when it comes bouncing back, if I play the same thing, it will come back as the standard tuning version. So you can find new voicings through this. But it's like travel for me. Sure. It's like enriching your mind.
I don't want to take up more time, but just to be clear, I'm not saying everyone should stay in standard tuning, but that if you approach standard tuning in this kind of exploratory way, it actually arms you to explore those other tunings, in a different way, because you've broken that sort of attached connection of the fretboard space to the musical space, and you kind of encountered that disruption. So
exactly,
I'll leave it there. Great presentation, though. Wonderful.
Thank you so much, Mark. It's nice to see you.
Jonathan D'Souza, where do you want to jump in?
Hey, thank you so much for this great talk, and it's great to see so many cool people here. Yeah, this was just awesome. I guess I maybe I have a question. I think I do have a question, but maybe like a comment first. I love when just in the chat here, Alan, wrote, "The guitar must remain as our favorite toy," when you were demonstrating the fretboard remapper. And I was kind of thinking kind of the same thing. It's what you're doing with that kind of tool or toy that you've created. It just seems so playful. And I've just been recently reading this book about play, this kind of classic book about play, Huizinga's Homo Ludens, right? And he says how play involves like kind of stepping away from the everyday or the ordinary way of doing things, kind of setting up rules and constraints for yourself to be free within. It's like all there, right? And then he talks about how play is essential for art, especially music, but also how play drives knowledge and drives new insight. And I feel like it's kind of all there in what you're doing, right? You've created this thing that's fun, right? It's just cool and fun. Yeah. And then it also kind of generates this insight that's really stunning and really powerful. And just the whole talk was amazing.
Thanks so much.
So the question I was going to ask about, I loved how you kind of coordinate these 4 different spaces, right? And I mean, as a, I think, almost everything or so much of what you say here is actually applicable to the violin and, the cello,
sure. Yeah.
all these other kind of, tiered array string instruments as well. So we can even imagine your kind of F space as just the kind of the instrument, right? The
instrumental domain,
right? And I love how then you kind of traced all of the possible connections between like all of the pairs. But when you went to the West Montgomery example and kind of took one out, you were kind of left with a triad, a kind of triangle in the space. And if you want, I feel like you could look at all of the 4 triangles, right? You can take.
Oh, that's a brilliant idea. I love that.
Case you'll have a kind of triad, and that might itself be a kind of, an interesting zone, right? So you kind of described one of those. Wes Montgomery, as you said, he knows his theory, he knows his fretboard, he knows the sound very, very well.
I grew up thinking that he was a sort of intuit because everyone told me that until I saw that. And,
right. Yeah.
And I love to illuminate virtuosities. I mean, my other thing is micro timing, which is a hidden virtuosity that sort of people put to feel, and feel is great, but it's a sort of, there's a mythology around it that it somehow doesn't count, or it isn't work, or it didn't take thought or drive and all those things. But I love that idea of the portions of it. And actually what I tried to suggest is that actually by taking one out, you strengthen and work the others harder, because we all rely too much, like when I'm soloing in jazz and I'm looking at the page and I see the chord symbols, they trigger my, oh, this is my C major 7 arpeggio. This is the sort of things that doesn't feel like play to me. It feels like, why am I doing this? And you've sort of been led to this world. But then when you take out, okay, we won't tell you what the chords are, and just listen and play, then suddenly it's a scary thing, and you feel like you're in a different zone of knowing. And this isn't to take away notation. Notation's wonderful. I'd love to just go from look at notation and analyze without touching the instrument. That would be a useful tool. So all the pairs, all the handshakes that are there. So there are 4 zones. So you could have all of them, or 3, triads and so on. You could have all these combinations of it. I think that would be an interesting pedagogical exercise. Say, let's work on sight analysis, or just transcribing what you're hearing on the guitar. All of these would be useful. Sorry, I'm interrupting your.
Yeah, no. That's exactly that was exactly my question. Kind of like, what do you think of those triads? Do they correspond to other interesting musical practices for you? So you're already answering that. That's what the question is.
Yeah, that's what, it's wonderful. And but what I got from your wonderful voluntary self-sabotage is the value in breaking them as well as strengthening them. So this overfluency is really interesting, because I play the push as well, Ableton Push, which is an 8x8 grid. Right. And it's you can tune it in fourths basically and chromatically. So I can play it quite quickly and well from the fretboard. But what happens is, as I ascend, I get this break when I should be going over the G to B string, and it still feel it. I'm practice it every day, but it still feel it. It's so hard and wired. And I don't think it's a good thing. And the second thing, it took me weeks to realize, I never play notes on the same row. You can on the push, but I just had this polyphony idea that everything has to be on strings, essentially. So it sounds silly, but it's helped me think of the guitar as we have all these hidden biases that we ingrain by practice. And one of the most profound things, as I mentioned, was playing the left-handed guitar upside down. I really recommend it just to try it. It's so funny and fun and playful, but you hear the chords for the first time because you break what that chord feels like, and then it comes out. And then I like the guitar again. Right. It's like when you go on holiday and you play the guitar in the sun, somehow you prefer the instrument. I think we should just create holidays.
Right. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Awesome. Thank you again.
Thank you very much.
I think it's fascinating to see sometimes how these different spaces are reflected in notations too. So although I'm personally not a big fan of fingering on guitar music, it did occur to me during your talk that is a kind of a bringing together 2 different kinds of conceiving of the music. And I've recently been looking at Spanish vihuela tablatures, where you see a really surprising way of approaching transposition. In staff notation in the 16th century, you tend to take, well, you can only put a given mode starting on its associated white note, D for Dorian, for example, and there are a limited number of alternative keys that fit the solfege system of the time. So you can have the Dorian mode on D, and on G is quite common, but you rapidly run out of allowable transpositions that fit comfortably in staff notation of the time. In other words, you run out of key signatures. But the vihuela fingerboard's a far more flexible system than the staff notation of the time could comfortably accommodate. There's nothing to stop you from playing in any mode on any location on the fingerboard, of course. That's not really true of keyboards because of the tuning systems they were using. So this all means that the tablature is a great system for the vihuela because it sets you free. You can take full advantage of the fretboard. Tablature doesn't care what key you write in, whereas staff notation of the time was much more conservative. So what's been interesting me is the way vihuelists thought about all of this, how they explained what they were doing. Nowadays on the guitar, we've got our tuning kind of given to us, more or less. And so we have to talk about transpositions on the fretboard. We'll say, okay, I'm in the Dorian mode, and the Dorian mode is transposed to F or C or E flat or whatever note you like. What the vihuelists did was to treat the tuning and the fingerboard as a kind of blank slate. In the example we're looking at from Narvaez, he's saying this is the Dorian mode on G, and G is on the first course open. In another piece, he might tell you that G is on a different course and a different fret. So instead of changing the key, you're changing your mental map of the fretboard. And the way Narvaez shows all this is to enhance the tablature, to actually change the tablature system to make it slightly hybrid. In the example on screen, he's providing a verbal instruction of where the anchor pitches, or clefs, are. He's putting an F clef and a C clef on the tablature. We can see a crosshatch shape that's a C clef and 3 diamonds that are an F clef. And the third symbol that looks like a tadpole is a tempo sign, actually. What I think is so interesting about this is the way in which the notation combines tablature. You've got the stylized picture of a fingerboard, but you've also got elements of staff notation. And these together serve a 16th century way of thinking about mode. I bring all this up because it reminds me of Jonathan de Souza's discussions of the fretboard, but also the presentation you've just given, where we see that to think like a guitarist or a vihuelist is to think of it differently from someone reared only on keyboards. And tablature, or a mental representation of the fretboard, can nudge musical thinking in unusual directions.
That's an excellent point. And I think many times we are all too often blind to what the usual and unusual are. For example, the only people who have ever asked me why there are 12 notes are postdoctoral researchers or PhD students or children. And then the whole time in between, we dutifully work within a system. And this isn't helped by the idea that when we write a score and we open up Sibelius, we write in a meter without any question of where a meter comes from, that the meter emerges from the rhythm. It's not something you write in, it comes from. And Jonathan, your example reminds me of an Ockeghem piece where basically it's the same notes, but you choose which clef you sing from. And it's such a twisted, beautiful, quietly radical idea that you just pop the clef on that you want and suddenly you're singing it in Dorian. I love that idea. You're not manipulating the notes, you're manipulating the template, the canvas. And it's this sort of canvas manipulation that's really interesting. I don't know if you've seen the Bach motif, the BACH motif, represented as a crucifix with 4 clefs, just 1 dot. It's so nice. So it's 1 dot is 4 different notes. And that pluripotency of musical objects is something that I see in the guitar and is used. I don't know if you know Brett Wilmot's book, but the first exercise is there's a shape and you have to name every possible conceivable chord symbol from the shape, not the other way around. We're not given a chord symbol, which is the thing, and then you make it. You have a shape and then you fit it into the structure. And I love this twisting of what's content and what's context. I hope that makes some sense.
Yeah, it's really surprising to see like the space being changed. Where you're so used to holding the space the same and then moving the dots around. And then in some of these models, we're seeing certain dot-like structures, such as a mode mapped on the fingerboard staying the same. And then the space behind it changes, like the imaginary tuning or where the clefs are.
That's why there's something sort of visceral about that fretboard diamond image of seeing the stave on the guitar on the stave. And we struggle in silence with that. over and over again. But then when you see it next to each other, there's a sort of, it becomes quite impactful, for me at least.
People kept telling you on Facebook that
I was doing something wrong.
That it was wrong.
Let's have a look. So it's so confusing, but this should be right. So let's take the E's, for example. The E on the first string is open. On the second string is the 5th fret. On the third string is the 9th fret. It's quite hard to, it's slightly wonky because of the spacing issue, but I try to get as close as possible. The 4th string would be, the E is on the 14th fret, which is exactly right. Yeah, we're just below the 15th. 5th string would be on, help me out, Jonathan, 5th string.
On the 19th fret.
That's good, bang on. And then the 24th fret of the 6th string, if you're lucky enough to have an Ibanez gem. And I really like this. And what's nice is that we've got bright and warm. I mean, roughly speaking, other things being equal, and resonant and tight. So you sort of see the idea that you can skate in this. And these are just some natural notes. This is a block of chromatic notes.
But just to be clear, Milton, it takes a moment to notice on this diamond that some of the note heads are offset from the lines to show that they're not necessarily.
Yeah.
You're not necessarily saying that only these frets are being the Roman numeral frets that they're like sometimes it's a bit above or a bit below.
We could have some, I mean, really we want smaller dots, but I wanted the note head imagery there. So yes, it's good, it's illustrative. And actually it's impossible to do it with straight lines, I realize deep into the exercise. Because these gaps aren't the same, remember, this is not a chromatic. The vertical spacing of the stave is not consistent, but it is of frets. Does that make sense? So they never line up exactly, but it's close enough, I think.
Some things went by so very fast, and again, please everybody, I'm still looking at Q&A in chat and looking for people to invite. Rosenwinkel went by quite fast, because you mentioned Jonathan de Souza's chapter and voluntary self-sabotage and so on, but I was thinking that maybe some people that haven't, might not be aware of what you're referring to, and even the book this comes from and so on. And so one of the things I do want to ask you about is some of the references and how people will get started.
Yes, yeah, well, we'll have I have a bibliography at the end, but I tend to do bibliographies in keynote presentations, in PowerPoint presentations as credits rolling by. I don't know why, it's this thing I can't help doing now. But this is, and Jonathan's here so he can speak more on it, is, I believe, from, it's a chapter in Music at Hand, and it's a chapter called Voluntary Self-Sabotage, about essentially guitarists or chordophone players, I think, breaking that tight map between familiar shapes and expectations and the resulting sound. And this wonderful piece, Zhivago by Kurt Rosenwinkel, he has this extraordinary tuning, which you can see here. It breaks completely his familiar shapes. What he does is he plays rather familiar, like 2-5-1-y shapes, and this wonderful sound comes out. And it's probably his most popular tune, and it comes from wanting a sense of play and actually voluntarily breaking that hard-earned connection between auditory output and physical familiarity. I hope I've paraphrased that well enough, Jonathan de Souza. Yes, that chat's all about guitarists. Okay, exactly right. Oh, thank goodness. That would have been embarrassing. So, and what Jonathan brought to my attention is the idea of consistency, which is how many strings move are relationally similar to standard tuning, and then how many shifts away, how many turns of a peg are needed, essentially, which is a lot. And this means that there's a fourth between the two, between the highest and lowest string. I hope that's right. And we've got a good Rick here. So it, and a wild inconsistency. So if you have a 2-note shape here, it's going to be different on every adjacent position.
Can you remind us what is the unit of stretchiness?
Okay,
What
so
is 1.8 of what?
Okay, so stretchiness is a great question. Let me get to it. Is the average number of chromatic gaps between strings. So if we take strings tuned in major thirds, you can just go 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, and it will just move smoothly on, and you don't have to move out of position or stretch your finger in order to get to the next note. So it's the average number of chromatic gaps between the strings. So on the guitar, on the standard tuning, for most of the strings, you have to incorporate 1 fret out of position. The reason it's not 1 is because of the major third.
Which isn't stretchy at all.
Which isn't stretchy at all. But perfect fourths, I think, would have a stretchiness of 1, I believe. Let's just check. Yes, a stretchiness of exactly 1. Augmented tuning has got 0, but you can have negative stretchiness too. Nashville tuning overlaps on adjacent strings in position, so it has a negative stretchiness.
Just the bottom 3 strings of a 10-string guitar in modern tuning. The strings are just a whole step apart.
Perfect.
But they're on a fingerboard. They're not floating diapasons, so that means that they have negative stretchiness for sure.
Yeah, or scrunchiness is the opposite, I think.
Scrunchiness. Right.
I think this is quite hard to read, and I think what I'll do is turn them into radar charts. I think that would be better, and you can get a more visceral experience of these values.
Well, I was also wondering whether the order of the strings enters into the calculations.
And yes, so I only did this calculation on ascending strings, and my fretboard remapper can you can just suddenly reorder the strings randomly, and it's fine, but I don't know what it means for stretchiness component.
Is Nashville tuning what's also called high-strung guitar, where the bottom 4 strings are an octave higher?
Exactly.
Yeah, which evolved rather than taking the top sets of 12-string sets and just stringing guitars with just the top of this, so that they could get a sound of a 12-string with 2 guitars in the studio.
Exactly. So Gambale is somewhat similar. I don't know if you know that, Mark. Gambale's tuning uses standard strings, but kind of reordered, so they compress in a sort of Nashvilleian way. So you get the familiar shapes become nice close voicings, which is really fun to experience.
One thing we haven't done is explore a lot implications in different spaces. So in in his article on guitar thinking, Jonathan D'Souza analyzes 2 Brouwer studies, and we have a kind of analysis of the movements on the fingerboard. And it's interesting to consider like a conventional analysis of the pitches interacting with all of these familiar movements that guitarists feel on the fingerboard. So for example, in I've got a guitar here in number 7, is it? The one that starts like. You know, you've got this stack of thirds of different sizes, which is capable of being of simply continuing down in the thirds, and then this interval gets echoed at other times. And it's fascinating to read Jonathan de Souza's analysis, because it also explores how the fingers move with some of the actual shapes that stack of thirds gives you. And
yes,
what I'm kind of curious about is, it's interesting to what extent one can hear fretboard space. Because you would think that aural space would be this kind of pure zone. I think in a way we're taught to think of it that way, as something where, the music just exists in all of its, just what the composer heard. But in fact, it's often very clear that you can hear quite directly what the composer felt or imagined the performer would feel.
I think we've all had that experience when we hear something played on the guitar, and we just know where it appears before we know the note names. So we have a direct connection between the acoustic space of it that bypasses our abstracted representations. I think that de Souza has a survey going which looks at recognizing the fretboard from the acoustic space. It's a good time to plug it. But there was a test on recognizing plausible voicings, essentially. It's a sort of perfect pitch test, but connected to the instrument, which I imagine is exploring that. I don't know if he wants to say. But this is the movements that you're talking about, perhaps, which are these sort of mechanisms. And what's really beautiful about this is that I happen to know this analysis of dual interval spaces. So this is a Schoenberg piece, and this G and B are in major third relationships here. And then these little stabs come out in sort of an orbit around it, a symmetrical orbit around it. And so with the fretboard remapper, you can play that exactly and feel that space, which connects a viscerality to the music that would be otherwise foreign to my physical knowledge, at least. So yes, I'm very interested in abstract versus concrete musical thinking.
Stanley Yates has a question.
Have you come up with interval vectors for standard guitar shapes? Do you mean interval? Yes, interval vectors. So yeah, that's quite easy because I've made this thing which just basically gives vectors to whatever you want to play. So you, oh, that's nice actually. What's really nice is you can practice all your trichords, like this one, which you don't normally get to play on the guitar, and the sunshine chords, and it becomes a geometric exercise. And yeah, so for each of these, in the corner is so with an augmented triad, you'll have 3 major thirds, and I've got this scrunchiness meter. I better turn it on so you can see how scrunchy each chord is, just in case you can't tell by listening to it.
Milton, with your fretboard remapper, would it be possible for you to input an interval vector and then it would come up with positions?
Is your aim basically to get a taxonomy of interval vectors appearing on the instrument? Is that what you're interested in?
I mean, of course, whenever I hear you speak on something, my mind gets boggled and I think I have an inkling of an idea, but I'm still trying to formulate it. But I'm thinking about, there are certain idiomatic finger shapes that are common to everybody's hands.
Yeah.
And they're basically, well, I guess a mapping of the human hand to a guitar neck in a reasonable way. And it'd be interesting to know what interval content, what possible intervals fall under some of those shapes. but also if we have an interval vector, to have a simple solution to finding the shapes that contain those intervals seems to me would be very interesting. I could imagine something like this as a means of generating idiomatic shapes.
It's a great
that
idea.
A composer who doesn't play the guitar.
Oh yeah, because it would feed it through on a string per note within a position, or maybe with the open string. It's a brilliant idea. So it finds a voicing. So you could play a chord, and then it would distribute it within a position, or using open strings or something like that. That would be amazing. I haven't done that.
Well, I found this astonishing that the Hendrix chord has one of each interval class.
I was amazed.
There's something remarkable about that.
I know, it's incredible, because the one we learn is the upside down version of it. It's it reorders it, and this is mentioned as a zygote. Jonathan Leithwood would know probably what I'm talking about. You probably know what I'm talking about. I can't remember the exact number, but it's because this is the wrong order. This is the inversion. This is the B version of it, and I can't believe no one's mentioned it. I don't know if anyone, please tell me if you've seen it before, but I discovered it about a year ago, and I've been telling everybody I can about it since, because it's just wonderful. It's just amazing. And what's beautiful is that it's not with the fifth. It's those four notes. And that's the sort of bias we have, is that everyone calls it dominant 7 sharp 9. It's not, it's a major minor thing which doesn't have a fifth. That's how Hendrix played it. That's how it feels on the guitar. And it's this battling this idea that it's somehow impoverished because we're leaving out a note. No, we have all the notes we need. There's also another one, by the way, which is that's a nice, more diatonic one. See, that's always got all the ones. It's really beautiful. Colorful. So you get these octatonic version and a very diatonically shimmery version as well. So cool. And it makes this make sense to me in a far more practical way than trying to calculate these in analysis. It's a sort of, it bypasses that.
Perhaps another function of this, we have, as you've pointed out, essentially an almost infinite number of configurations. In terms of composition or improvisation, we can't literally be dealing with an infinite number of possibilities. We need a vocabulary.
Yeah.
And this kind of mapping of intervals into certain shapes could provide a vocabulary.
Yeah, that's a brilliant idea, and I would love to do that. What you might like is that you could just decide to randomize the strings. And I could randomize their movement too. I would never in a million years think of this. I love it. And so even if it's arbitrary, you can find. And what's really beautiful is you can use the hexagrams of the I Ching here, which stops you from playing those strings. So your challenge is basically, can you play that hex, this trichord with just these strings? Yes, I can. And it's a voicing I would never have thought of, and it's really beautiful. And can I play a cluster? I'd have to go from B to that's a go. So I would never have thought of this chord in my whole life without that impetus from you and these constraints. Constraints are everything. One thing I wanted to mention, Jonathan, is that Catalan's micro capos can be put here as well. So I can add a capo wherever I want. And I can do it with any tuning as well. I like it. Anyway, sorry. Tell me when you've had enough, Jonathan.
We should wrap up soon. I was thinking one of the places that people can go to is the Soundboard Scholar site. I want to put a link to it here because this is where ultimately we can put all of the materials from this day as that people are willing to share. But are you not also writing, is not some of this also going to be a chapter in an anthology of essays on the 21st century guitar?
Yes, I mentioned it earlier. This is the...
right, not the hidden music. This is the other...
Yeah, that's it.
Right.
That's a chapter forthcoming, McGrath, Perks, editors. It's called 21st Century Guitar, Evolutions and Augmentations. And all the chapters are finished, so we're going through that grind now. It's been wonderful. I just want to say, actually, on behalf of everyone, to thank Jonathan Leithwood for putting this together. I think it's so wonderful that research is an active, fun, playful conversation rather than a factory of articles that three people read and misunderstand. And so one of the good things that have come out of COVID is you putting this together, and it's more vibrant than many conferences that I've been to. So I want to thank you for putting it all together.
Thanks. It is interesting how, what we're doing right now is a very different kind of interaction. It's also much easier for people to slip away from if they want to.
I should say, Jonathan D'Souza's study that I mentioned is in the chat now. Email him for details.
A lot of what you're doing, Milton, this is actually a question I asked Jonathan D'Souza when he was the keynote speaker last year for the GFA online stuff. And a lot of us have taken theory classes, music theory classes, but you're using a lot of tools here, even Neo-Riemannian theory for that matter, that maybe either arise in graduate study or postgrad study or just don't, right? There's a mathematization, use of transformational models and so on. And in your case, I think particularly geometrical ways of looking at things, visual ways of looking at things that, maybe I'm not going to go away from this talk and immediately know how to create my own models. So what are like maybe 3 ways of getting started, like 3 books or articles or other kinds of materials that have kind of set you on this path and actually helped you get some of the skills that you're showing, apart from the Apple Keynote user manual?
I don't use the manual. I absolutely adore.
No, of course you don't. No.
Well, I think it's simple enough to find them. It's very strange because I can't really point at there isn't a very good NRT paper, but I've linked some that I kind of worked through. I think they're not always presented very helpfully. Pitch set theory isn't for me. I didn't understand it for a long time till a conversation with you, and then just kind of working it out, penciling it myself, basically. And maybe that's the way to do it. But I can certainly list them. I mean, this has been a really beautiful insight, is Neo-Riemannian theory for me, where if you lay out the chords, the notes, not in linear form, but fifths along this direction, and major thirds in this direction, and minor thirds in this direction. What happens is that you play a major triad and you get a triangle that's upright, and a minor triad looks like this. But it means that we can conceive of music as being voice-led by moving any one of these notes. And so we can instantly see all the notes, all the chords that have a C in them. Anyway, I've got a lot of material on this that I've presented in a way that's visual and I found more compelling that I'm happy to share. A lot of it is on my site, but I think probably a good one is Capuzzo's analysis of Pat Martino, which I mentioned, where he talks about the augmented triad and how it can move to all these different chords. But I would advocate for a sort of play using whatever tools are available. And it's you inspired me this, Jonathan, when you talked about the trichords and how you memorized like the Debussyan trichord by putting something visual imagery and having them as characters and not just as these fort numbers, plain fort numbers. And that's how I treat all of these, that memorize the trichords not as numbers but as the twilight chord and the sunshine chord, which is this one to me, and I can recognize orally and visually and abstractly through having these a visceral engagement with knowledge. But to answer your question, I will share all the stuff I have, but I tend to make my own notes for students. And a lot of it is about teaching students who have different types of literacy, a lot of computer-based musicians and notation-based musicians, and finding the meta concepts that speak to all.
What about your use of data graphics to illustrate almost every point? You know, every point you've got, there's an animation or a way of visualizing it. Where does that come from?
The ideas behind them, or how they physically happen?
Yeah, the idea of making beautiful graphics and animations.
Thank you very much, first of all. Well, I think it's partly because I grew up at CERN. My dad was a nuclear physicist, so the idea of communicating through any means necessary is very natural for me. But also coming late to music theory and notation means I don't have some allegiance to the score, so for example, I noticed this passage in a Coltrane piece where he takes this one phrase and he transposes it, but he also plays it on different beats, and sometimes he plays it long. And so there are three sort of genes of expression that change. And I happen to know a biological model called Raupp's cube, which shows all possible seashells in this cube formation, because seashells have got three genes that describe their shape. So I made this. The possible configurations are on 3 dimensions. So we can think of musical objects not on this linear stave, which gives up one of its dimensions for time, but this non-linear collection of objects. So it comes with the idea, and this came from walking, basically just walking, and suddenly I saw it and then laid it out. But it's usually about the concepts behind finding the most simple way to think of it. This is a Django Reinhardt solo, and where he places within the beat his favored zones. Again, if you're thinking notationally, then you'll start sort of putting arrows on notation. But if we're talking about a periodic beat that repeats, breaking away from that timeline is always a useful strategy, as well as sort of trying to focus on a sort of naive representation of the important stuff. This is Spiegel and Spiegel on a postcard. It's the entire piece. There's melody in one symbol, and so it's basically, because I'm not very smart and I'm not very musical, but I like beautiful things and just trying to present them as simply and beautifully as possible. I hope that answers the question.
It does, and you're also very well known for your work in data sonification.
Thank you. You're being so nice. Thanks.
Is
Yes,
the,
and in fact that helps because you're immediately open to visualizing, conceptualizing around beyond the structures that we tend to use in music.
can you turn data into a fretboard, a tuning and
Yes.
an arrangement of frets?
Yes, absolutely. In fact, one of my pieces is basically takes swarming behaviors of different animals for a guitar ensemble and basically navigate. So, for example, if they're going from one location to another on the neck, but you have rules of how you can get there, and everyone's doing it in different ways, but you get these swarming behaviors that occur. So yes, you can use the space of the guitar fretboard as in that way. And also one thing that I can do with this is on different channels is that you can send them out to different places as well. So I've done these things where I've performed on the guitar, but to two different audiences, but the strings were split, so people had different outputs from the same. Could the Shakespeare sonnet be transcribed as a piece? Yes. The answer is always yes to those things. I'm absolutely crazy about it. And if you're at all interested in my work, then on my site, miltonline.com, you might want to look at Hidden Music, which has got a whole series of works around various biology and nature, or turning paintings into music, or geological data and sleep data and so on. So I have a whole host of them that you can just listen to. So that's all automated, of salt crystals crystallizing and then playing across the piano, and so on, and a series of geometries, which are just intersections of various shapes. And what's interesting is that you get expressive turns by these. So it allows us to think of motifs as geometrical shapes passing through each other. Anyway, there's hours of it if you're interested. Sorry.
I'm just marking a moment of speechlessness.
Thank you. But yes, you can, and I think we should. And I think that music is it's a stunning mixture of history, biology, culture, mathematics, expression, communication, societal interaction, that it's endless as a vehicle and a context for basically communicating, which is what all of my work does, whether it's translation of blood cells or fretboard positions. So I've talked a lot. I think we've homes to stay in.
That's right, exactly. I think we really wanted to end with just this idea of people understanding, everything you're doing and where to find it. And
thanks so much. This is miltonline.com, not miltononline.com, which is, I've been too clever. It's just miltonline.com. No one can spell my last name, so you can find most of the stuff there. And occasionally I post to YouTube, and there's stuff about composers, Arvo Pärt and Bartók and others, that uses similar visual representations you may enjoy.
Thank you so much, Milton, and also thank you so much for the incredible amount of work you put into making your simple speech into this amazing multimedia experience for us.
No, thank you, and thank you everybody for sticking around. It's been wonderful.